Hello, wonderful boys and girls, and welcome to Storytime with Avant-garde Books. I'm Sheree Hardy, and today I will be reading Brick by Brick. This book was written by Charles R. Smith Jr., and it was illustrated by Floyd Cooper. If you have a copy, feel free to read along with me, but if you don't, it's quite okay. Get in a very comfortable place, get relaxed, and listen to Brick by Brick. Under a hazy, hot summer sun, many hands work together as one. The president of a new country needs a new home. So many hands work together as one. Black hands, white hands, free hands, slave hands. Slave hands dig, saw, and break stone, laying the foundation for the president's home. Rented as property, slave hands labor as diggers of stone, sawyers, and bricklayers. Diggers swing axes to break up stone, laying the foundation for the president's home. Jerry, Jess, Charles, Lynn, Dick, Bill, Harry, Jim. Slave hands swing axes 12 hours a day, but slave owners take, slave hands pay. Slave hands sweat under a bright sun, slave hands toil until each day is done. Chiseling, carving, and transporting stone, slave hands ache, dark skin to white bone. Slave hands blister under a bright hazy sun, slave hands toil until each day is done. Sawyers saw blades through logs of oak wood, 7 days a week where a forest once stood. Alec, Ben, William, Moses, Simon, Peter, Frank, Thomas, up, down, push, pull, 2 men per pit saw, sprang sawdust until slave hands are raw. Slave hands saw 12 hours a day, but slave owners take, slave hands pay. Slave hands bleed under a hot hazy sun, slave hands toil until each day is done. Clay, sand, and water is mixed by young slave hands to create bricks. Nameless, faceless daughters and sons build brick by brick until each day is done. Oyster shells mixed with rocks, lime, and sand become mortar for bricks spread by slave hands. Will, Nace, Jared, Manuel, Liverpool, Lester, Herbert, Samuel. Slave hands spread mortar 12 hours a day, but slave owners take, slave hands pay. Slave hands crack under a hot hazy sun, slave hands toil until each day is done. Slave hands learn a new trade skills, using chisels, saws, hammers, and drills. Skilled hands earn 1 shilling per day, reaching slave hands closer to freedom with pay. Brick by brick, slave hands build. Day by day, slave hands gain skill. Month by month, slave hands toil, planting seeds of freedom in fertile soil. Freedom has a price in a land of liberty, so slave hands toil to no longer be property. Brick by brick, where a forest once stood, grows the president's home, made of stone and oak wood. Slave hands build and slave hands save, shillings to be free and no longer be a slave. Slave hands count shillings with worn fingertips and purchase freedom, earned brick by brick. The end, boys and girls, here is a note from the author Charles R. Smith Jr. Why were slaves used to build the White House? Today we know that the White House exists in the big city of Washington, D.C., but when construction began in 1792, it was in the middle of nowhere. Manpower was needed to clear the forest, build a house, and make all the fine details inside. Lots of manpower, local workers, including immigrants from Scotland and other countries, were hired, as well as free blacks, but it wasn't enough. That's where slaves came in. After realizing there weren't enough workers in the population to assist in construction, the government looked to slaves to round out the workforce. Slave owners from Virginia and Maryland received $5 a month to rent out each slave. After a hard day of work, slaves returned to a small shared hut and ate from the rations of pork, beef, and cornmeal provided to them. Slaves endured a snake-infested island and mosquito swarms to dig up the stones needed for the walls of the house. They endured hour after hour of cutting and trimming wood, often until their hands were bloody or deformed. The work was hard on the body, especially the hands. I chose to focus on the hands because all of the work was done at a time when machines didn't exist to do those same jobs. Hand is also another name for a laborer or worker. Thus, many slaves were needed to turn a wooded forest into our country's most famous address. As the house began to be completed on the outside, skilled workers were needed to finish the inside. Skilled craftsmen from other countries taught the slave trades such as cabinet making and carpentry. These skills allowed the slaves a chance to earn money and eventually pay for their freedom. Unfortunately, the original White House was burned down by the British on the night of August 24, 1814. During the most dramatic episode of the War of 1812, it was later rebuilt and restored to its original condition and stands as a reminder of the contribution made by slaves who worked toward freedom, brick by brick. Boys and girls, and that message was from Charles R. Smith Jr., the author. Boys and girls, thank you for listening to Brick by Brick. This book was written by Charles R. Smith Jr., and it was illustrated by the late Floyd Cooper.